Hi, Amanda.
Hi, Talia.
Welcome to the Good Mood Podcast. So today we're going to talk about psychedelic medicine and the art of microdosing psychedelics for mental health. And I know that you're really interested in this topic. And how did you get interested in it?
It was a bit of a journey to get here. I think I was doing a kind of naturopathic medical mission to Peru in my second year of naturopathic school. And that was sort of the time that documentary DMT, the Spirit Molecule, came out on Netflix. So I watched that and kind of got interested in looking into DMT and all of the psychedelic medicines as I was traveling to a place that they are indigenous to. And that was the beginning of my journey with plant medicines in regards to healing on a deep level, and how they can be used in ceremony and in ritual. And that was back in 2014. So around that time is when a lot of this microdosing research and this what's called the third wave psychedelic renaissance kind of began becoming a little bit more public knowledge. So I just noticed that in my free time, that's all I was reading about. I was devouring any piece of information, any article, any documentary I could find on the subject. And that interest has just continued, and that space has grown a lot today. So there's even more resources out there.
It's powerful. So many people are asking about it in my private practice. Obviously, we can't recommend it as naturopaths, and they're not legal substances at this point, but so many people are sort of endeavoring it on their own and just checking in with their health practitioners about incorporating that into their plan. It's very interesting. Why do you think you became so fascinated with it?
That's a good question. I think I've always been interested in the way that intention and different plants can alter our mood in general, and as well as our consciousness. I have a background as a chef as well, so using literal plants to help someone feel better or change their mood in that respect has just been a big part of who I am since a child, and what brought me to naturopathic medicine kind of in the first place. So it was sort of a natural evolution as I was moving along my naturopathic medical career and learning more and more. And it's just this amazing tool that is beginning to come back into the consciousness of healing and healthcare practitioners. And as you said, not legal or able to be used in practice right now, but there are so many studies being done by reputable universities, so much fundraising going on, phase 3 clinical trials, changes in law and policy, and I feel like it's such a powerful tool that we have. And a really relatively safe one compared to so many of the options out there, that why not explore it and learn how to support people through their own journey in discovering it as more and more people do experiment themselves as well.
Mm-hmm. It's like this sort of continuum of plant medicine. Like you talked about these edible plants, which obviously we can take in massive doses, right? Like dandelion leaves or something,
Totally.
garlic mustard. And then you have sort of mid-range, something like reishi, where you're taking hundreds of milligrams. And then you have these psychedelic medicines that are very powerful that are interacting with, and all of these plants are interacting with receptors, whether it be taste receptors or DMT receptors. And it's just this spectrum of different actions that plants have on our bodies. It's very interesting. So it makes sense that you went from sort of culinary plant uses to now being interested in some of the more psychoactive, psychotropic entheogens, which is really cool.
Yeah, and I think it also then allows people to recognize the power that other plants do have as well, like the energetics of dandelion and how it can help to, it's really effective obviously for liver function, so it can help like remove these obstacles as the first one in the spring to pop out, a time where our bodies generally need a little more support in detoxing. So just connecting with plants in general and tapping into their consciousness as a whole system, I think that entheogens also are bringing us back to that connection to earth, which is something that, humanity has been maybe a little lacking in for a while, and is a part of what I believe to be the root cause of so much mental health disorder as well, is that lack of connection to our actual human nature.
It's one of the things that people say is like when they interact with mushrooms or ayahuasca, that there's this deep connection that they feel to nature and this deep curiosity towards nature that maybe they never felt before. And it's interesting you say that. It's almost like a more overt experience in talking with those plants, where it's very conscious, very obvious psychotropic experience, whereas with dandelion it's maybe more subtle, but there still can be profound effects on healing. It's just more of a deeper, maybe organ system based in experience, which is, but it's beautiful that it can introduce people to the realm of plant medicine and how powerful plants can be. You can't deny how powerful a plant is if you've experienced something like ayahuasca, which is, yeah.
And even as sort of we've now entered the legal cannabis space here in Canada, at least, and noticing how that can be entheogenic for a lot of people and create this really conscious altering experience, and very dose dependent and context dependent, as I'm sure we'll get into as we continue to speak. But even that, where that's that bridge between an abundant kind of edible plant that's all around us and this really powerful psychedelic entheogen, and it's more, it can be more gentle depending how you use it, but a lot of people are now gaining access to it in a different way and potentially using it in a different way. And there's more conversations about how you can create intentional altered consciousness and how you can use these plants to change your mindset and mental health and physical health. So I find that we're in a really potent time of changing the conversation around all of this as well.
Mm-hmm. And totally, it's almost like cannabis used to be seen as this gateway to these hard drugs. Now it's almost like a gateway to nature and plant medicines in general, and sort of like accessing these altered states of consciousness that people may have shied away from before because there was so much stigma around it. And after the 60s, in the 1980s or so. And so you're mentioning things like the research. And so actually maybe let's define microdosing. Maybe you can do that for us and talk about like what we mean when we're talking about microdosing.
So microdosing is taking a sub-perceptual dose, typically of one of the classical psychedelic or entheogen medicines, such as LSD or magic mushrooms containing the active ingredient psilocybin. And people have been self-experimenting with these substances and taking small enough doses that you don't feel typically high, but you just kind of feel better is the reported outcome of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some people describe it as like extremely, so there are some schools of thought that if you can feel anything, your dose is too high. But some people will report a little bit of a sensation, maybe a little sense of vigor, or some people describe it as like a sparkly feeling or just a sort of buzz. But typically you're not getting any hallucinations. You're not talking to God or your alien family or your dead relatives. Like you're basically operating as normal with this maybe very, very background difference in sensation or.
Yeah, sort of having like the best cup of coffee you've ever had. Like that alters your mood. That's not sub-perceptual. You feel different when you have that. But do you feel like you're on a psychedelic or altering your consciousness in this deep, profound way? I mean, maybe for some people, but in general, yeah, that's kind of the idea, is adding something that helps to alter your state in a way that is still congruent with your everyday life.
Mm-hmm. Right. And you said maybe like 1/10 to 1/20 of a dose is typical, but it could vary depending on the person.
Exactly. And the substance as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And where did it arise from? Like how did people begin to begin this practice? You want to talk about the history of it a little bit? Or?
I mean, in the research and stories that I've uncovered, and maybe you found it in a different way, so people in Silicon Valley were kind of experimenting with this in order to problem solve creative solutions as well. There's a gentleman, James Fadiman, who wrote the Psychedelics Guide to Exploration. I forget the exact name of the book.
Psychedelic Explorer.
But he sort of pioneered. Yes, that's it. So he sort of pioneered the idea of microdosing as a protocol and for specific reasons. And I think when his kind of research came out and he was asking for anecdotal submissions of people's own experience with it and kind of collating all of that in order to provide a better resource for anyone who is interested, and along with his suggested protocol, and that was sort of like the base of that microdose mini revolution that began occurring, is I think based on his work.
Mm-hmm. I think he essentially the one that brought into popularity, I think, and then he was on the Tim Ferris podcast, and that was sort of when people started to experiment with it, because it was all in the biohacking realm of people trying to optimize their health and mood. And I think he talks about it sort of for two purposes. One is to optimize positive mood states, creativity, openness, happiness, focus, concentration, even just an adherence to health regimes like self-care, and then to decrease negative mood states like depression, anxiety, social phobias, and things like that. And so people have been using it sort of in both directions. And then there's a little bit of anecdotal evidence, or some people reporting it for smoking cessation. I think some people have used it for things like that, for quitting substances that are undesirable and things like that.
And often people combine that with a breakthrough or recreational dose, and then use microdosing as kind of maintenance, along with the integration of that experience for themselves.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's often people will take it so it's not something that people will do every day. They'll take it one day and then have some rest days in between. Can you talk about some of the protocols? I know like there's various ones on the internet that people will use.
So the most common one that I've come across is dosing on day 1 and taking day 2 and 3 off, and then dosing again the day after that. And again, that'll be the 10th to 20th of a recreational dose of these substances. And basically that just allows some space for your body to not build up tolerance, allows space to kind of like integrate whatever is coming up. And that's generally been seen to be the most effective. And it's not necessarily something that someone will do for long periods of time as well, maybe for like a 30-day period to move through a space and be able to have the resources to change habits and behaviors that allow them to have that foundational mental health practice or health optimization, that then they no longer need that substance on a daily basis. And, maybe it's still there for them as a tool, but not something that they use continually.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting because it's not like an antidepressant where you're taking it every day and essentially relying on it to create a different mood state or to change brain chemistry permanently, or for as long as you're taking the substance. It's something that like will temporarily shift brain chemistry, obviously, because it's a psychedelic substance, but it's in the brain changes that happen that inspire us to change our behaviors or outlook or neural pathways that have potentially a lasting effect on someone's mood or on someone's life. So they're using it in these like intermittent doses to gain these changes that then we assume persist, or we hope will just persist beyond them continuing to take it. So it's so interesting, the difference between that and a medication or something like that.
Yeah, I think that what can be really powerful with these substances is also the way that they align with naturopathic principles of like really treating the root cause. Like you were saying, it's not something that you take every day forever. It's like, okay, how can we introduce something for a short period of time to create something that we're wanting or remove something that we're wanting moving forward. And so it's really kind of treating that root cause by changing it, not the brain chemistry per se, but there is this effect with psychedelics and entheogens on neuroplasticity and creating different pathways in our brain And I was reading an article the other day talking about actually the lasting effects that can be seen after taking a dose of psilocybin. And so there can be permanent changes from an occasional substance use. which I think is really interesting as well, because something like the classical antidepressants, they're, there can be lasting changes to brain chemistry, but you do need to be taking that every day to get the effect you want. Which, is another reason that I find these medicines so interesting, is that they're relatively very safe. Even in large doses, people have not died from taking these substances. That therapeutic window or therapeutic index of when the effective and lethal doses is so large. I don't even know if they've found that for LSD or psilocybin, where someone has actually taken enough of it for it to be lethal. So I think that we have so many things that we can take to alter our mood and health that actually have negative consequences. And, the risks are there and the benefits outweigh them for a lot of people. But as we continue to see the research unfolding for these substances, we're potentially providing people with a short-term, very safe way to deal with some of the challenges that come up for them.
And sort of radically alter maybe even perception or their ability to cope with adverse situations in their lives, which can sometimes be at the root of depression. And it's interesting to say that. I mean, with the harm score, I think LSD and psilocybin have harm scores of 5 and 7 compared to alcohol, which is around 72. So it's like like a tenth of the risk of alcohol in terms of harm in general. And I don't think there's ever been a lethal dose. I think maybe one elephant, there's that story of the elephant that was overdosed on LSD, but there were some other confounding factors, like maybe the elephant was just dosed extremely high or something else was going on with him. But there's never been a person that has died because of an overdose on any of these substances. Of course, there's the risk of things like bad trips or some agitation, potentially psychosis. I think even with microdosing, some people report feeling anxious or jittery. Maybe you could speak a bit of that or what people sometimes find when they take it.
I think that, so a piece of this whole space that also I'm really passionate about, I've actually volunteered at some local festivals at their the harm reduction spaces called Sanctuary. So basically just a safe space for people to come to at festivals when a lot of different substances are being used, often multiple ones at once. And as people are gaining more knowledge of these substances and it's becoming a little bit more mainstream and there's conversations and awareness around it, I think it's so important to educate people on what can happen during these experiences and the possibilities of what these substances can bring up in a person. So someone, taking a tab of acid at a music festival may not be expecting that this childhood trauma could be triggered by, this person wearing a certain outfit that they just see, and that memory is unlocked, and now they're in this space with their friends, probably drinking alcohol as well. And what do you do in that moment? And that's often where those bad trips come from, is you haven't created an environment that can be supportive of whatever will arise during that experience. So
like that set and setting that we
talked exactly about. So I forgot your original question of how that these substances can kind of like agitate people as well.
And but I think, and then, most side effects are dose response. And so when we're talking about a tab of acid versus a microdose, I mean, it's not that it's completely side effect free. There is the potential for slight adverse effects, but it's far less than a full trip dose of a substance if you're taking a 10th or a 20th of a dose.
So back more to that question. Also, so with some of the research that I was doing a few years ago as well, a friend of mine had been microdosing with LSD and noticed wasn't giving them the effect that they were looking for. It didn't ease their mood. It didn't enhance creativity. And they just kind of felt a little more agitated than usual. And what some people sort of suggest is when you are in that state of having anxiety and or depression, that if you just start with microdosing, it can kind of exacerbate the situation that you're in. And especially if that's the only tool you're using, not getting any sort of extra support, therapy of any kind to kind of talk through your experience as well. And I think it was James Fadiman as well, and some of that microdosing research actually suggests like to do that breakthrough or recreational dose in a supportive setting to kind of clear the way of these larger obstacles to cure, and then using microdosing to continue that awareness and to continue to kind of like unpeel the layers of what's holding you back from where you want to be.
That's so interesting. It's almost like creating a baseline of this is what it could be. And now we're going to almost use small doses to activate that memory of the larger trip that occurred. And there's really interesting research. So a man called Robin Carhart Harris, he doesn't research microdoses, but he does large scale trials with psilocybin. And he has this very interesting article. I don't think he coined this theory, but it's called the theory of the bipartite theory of serotonin signaling. And so he differentiates these two serotonin receptors, and serotonin is this like the happy hormone that gets activated by SSRI medications like Prozac. But there are various serotonin receptors in the body. One is the 5-HT1A, which are one of the main targets of the Prozac sort of SSRI medications. And then the 5-HT2A, which are the targets of most psychoactive substances like psilocybe and LSD. And very interesting where he says that there's almost these two methods of coping that those two receptors will activate. And the 5-HT1A receptors tend to activate pathways involved in passive coping. So it's like your boss sucks or you're in a toxic relationship, but it kind of takes the edge off the suckiness of your situation. And you're maybe not coming up with new solutions, but you're just tolerating the situation in a different way, and thus your mood is improved. Versus the active coping that tends to be activated by the 5-HT2A receptors that psilocybin or LSD might target, that is more associated with coming up with unique solutions to your problems, whether that be finding the courage to leave that relationship, or dealing with your work situation, or making new resumes to get new jobs. And so it's very interesting in that sense, where it's like when we're talking about, we sort of lends more to the idea of if you're doing intermittent dosing, when you're activating those active coping pathways, potentially you have these lasting effects because you've now found the courage or creativity or whatever it is within you to now change your situation to improve your mood. I don't know if you read about that or heard about that or what. Yeah.
I actually haven't heard about that specific theory of the bipartite serotonin receptors, but find it super interesting. And that makes so much sense if you kind of look into the other research that Robin Carhart Harris is doing with the way that brain connections change while on these substances, and kind of that dissolution of the default mode network, which is where those patterns of behavior are created, and how how you always drive the same way home or walk the same way home from the grocery store, kind of like the default mode network kicking in. And it also applies to the way you handle emotional situations or challenging tasks, is we have these ingrained patterns of, okay, well, when this happens, then I do this, and this is how I feel, and this is how I respond. And in using these substances, then we kind of collapse that default mode network and allow new connections to be created between different parts of the brain, and allows us to see things a little bit differently, just like you were saying with the 5-HT2A receptors, how it can allow you to enact different behaviors or habits to change the way you're seeing a situation. And there's brain changes going on in so many different levels at that point. So I'm so glad you brought up that theory. I'm going to look into that one more after we finish this today.
Yeah. And I'm so happy that you brought the default mode network, because this is one of the things that they're identifying as one of the causes of that ruminative depression where, like you mentioned, like you're driving the same way home, but then you're also reacting to situations in the same way. Like drips down a window pane, they're all sort of following the same track, and it doesn't take much to activate that whole process, whether you want it or not. Like we always remember how to ride a bike. It's not that you think consciously about riding a bike. It's not like you're observing, this is how I put my foot on the pedal. This is how I balance. This is what muscle I use. You just kind of get on and everything unfolds as you remember it. And the same can happen with negative mood states too. You were saying where, it could be one little trigger. Even you were even mentioning at the festivals, like, oh, that person's shirt is now triggering this implicit memory I've held. That now being in an altered mood state is now triggering. But then if you can work with that in a therapeutic setting, maybe, or even in a controlled way by using microdoses, that could be completely diverted and changed and reworked in a really powerful way that can have lasting effects on mood or just even the way we interact in the world.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's where a lot of the research that's moving ahead more quickly is actually for PTSD and trauma, and using also MDMA, which is not a classic entheogen, what they call an entactogen. And what it's doing is allowing these traumatic memories to be revisited without the same emotional reaction. And that's with that dissolution of the default mode network. It's like, okay, now I can see this experience objectively, or see it without the feeling of trauma in my body that I experienced at that moment, and allows you to process that experience as the person you are now, and with the intention of letting it not be stored in your body anymore, letting it not impact your mental state and behavior in the way that it potentially has been. And whether that's like a specific event, like in regards to PTSD, where you're able to pinpoint it, or that example of being at the festival is like, oh, this really traumatic thing happened and I wasn't actually really aware of it, and now it's coming up and I don't know what to do about it. So creating the space to know that, okay, well, these substances can allow us to access all parts of our consciousness, and how can that be beneficial?
And it's so beautiful. Yeah, I have a story actually of a friend who was experimenting with microdosing and was walking, I think just walking her dog, walked by somebody, a stranger, who gave her sort of like a facial expression of almost like disgust, sort of, I don't know, not a nice expression. And she's walking by him, observes that, and it occurs to her to think, oh, he made a face. So there was almost, and she describes it as like, she didn't experience any sort of impact, emotional impact on her personhood, on her identity related to his behavior. Whereas normally maybe she would have walked by someone who made a face at her and wondered, oh, what did I do wrong? Or what's wrong with me? Or why is he reacting that way to me? But there was this depersonalization of that situation where it had nothing to do with her, with her shortcomings or whatever it might have been. There was no taking that situation personally. And I think there's actually been research on that. The amygdala doesn't fire under the influence of certain psychedelics in the presence of negative facial expressions. And yeah, it was just, so she was like, yeah, I'm not taking things personally in the way that I might have before, when really there's no need to take that situation personally, because as a person just walking by me who I'm not going to interact with, and whatever issue they have with me, even if they do, even if it is about me, is obviously not personal, because I'm just somebody walking,
Yeah.
What kind of things have you heard, like either anecdotes or research, or
talk that out and break it down?
Mm-hmm.
Like the way that you did that experience of like, oh, this thing that happens to so many people all the time, and a lot of us are really good at taking something so innocuous as who knows what was going on with that person, why they would have made that facial expression, and letting that moment be colored by all of our traumas or wounds or insecurities, and go down this well-paved mental emotional pathway. And the way you said it exactly, it's that depersonalization that allows us to see that moment completely objectively, without emotion, and those are some of the lasting impacts that these substances can then have. It's like, oh, I remember when that happened. There's potential for me to feel this way about similar situations in the future, and create that compassionate curiosity towards yourself. And that awareness of, I noticed when this happened, I react this way, when in this other state, I didn't go down that whole spiral. So what's going on here, and how can I use that experience to move forward? And that can be so profound for people's
Mm-hmm. Oh no, you cut off.
mental health, everyday moments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's almost like a yeah, when you're saying the compassionate curiosity is such a powerful thing, and being able to understand that's a possibility, like you said, where you're like, you know, I never would have reacted this way. I wouldn't even have thought that possible. I wouldn't even have known that was an option for reaction, to just see somebody's behavior and not relate it back to myself. We're having a little bit of an internet connection issue, but
I think we're back.
Okay, we're good. Okay. Amazing. Yeah. Are there any anecdotes or research or things that you've come across recently that are sort of inspiring or have really like captured your excitement?
I think, yeah, what's capturing my excitement right now actually is a lot of the people within the kind of psychedelic community, and the people doing a lot of this really powerful and important research are sort of saying, global pandemic that we're in at this moment may be a catalyst and trauma that may be coming out of the collective experience of this pandemic. And just the fact that that's a part of the conversation, that's really exciting to me. And we notice that, like, okay, we have all of these really effective, safe, and powerful tools to use. How can we actually bring them to people when, like, we need them?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Like, I mean, there's a lot of talk that I've been listening to about, you know, there's this emotional plague as one of the major side effects, or this underlying pandemic that's occurring. And I think it was, I don't know if it was Wilhelm Reich or some psychoanalyst that was like, you know, the pandemic of the future will be psychoneurological and not viral. We're experiencing a viral pandemic currently, but underneath that are this pandemic of loneliness, of depression, of anxiety, triggered by the situation that's occurring, and it's sort of uncovering this underlying mental health crisis that we've been experiencing for some time.
Exactly.
Yeah. What is can you talk about some, I don't know if you're, so there are some resources. So obviously these substances are not legal. It's not, you know, if somebody's going to procure them, it's not going to be by legal means, but there are some research studies happening. And there are some organizations that are working with entheogens in this way. And I know that you've been in touch with them or are aware of some of them. Maybe you could talk about some of that, Amanda.
So there's actually a few interesting opportunities for that here in Toronto. So before all of the COVID-related restrictions came into place, a clinic opened up called Field Trip Health, where they are using ketamine for depression. So again, not like a classical entheogen, but one of these conscious altering substances that is actually a little bit more legal than LSD and psilocybin, clearly, if they're using it in a clinical setting here in Toronto. And so I just love that those spaces are being created, and again, opening that conversation. There's also a therapy center called Remedy here in Toronto. Dr. Ann Wagner, who is been working really closely with MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Sciences, one of the main organizations doing a lot of this research and fundraising especially. And so Dr. Wagner is training with them to become an MDMA assisted psychotherapist and bring that program into Toronto to have that be a space where people can be trained and under the experimental clinical guidelines, of course, so that it's a really contained legal situation as opposed to allowing access to it for everyone. But what's really interesting is she's doing research with couples therapy in MDMA. So people without a formal diagnosis of PTSD are gaining access to this type of experience as well. So I'm really excited that we have those opportunities local to us, and things are popping up here in Canada. Of course, there are other ones outside of Toronto, maybe I'm not quite as aware of, but just the fact that it's happening is such a vast difference between when that kind of journey started for me 6 years ago of leaning into all of this information. So that's super exciting.
Yeah, it's like this third wave, which I think you mentioned, where it's now becoming more mainstream. People are curious about it. There are potentially legit ways to access some of these therapies, whether it be through studies or through some clinical trials that they're doing. Or even there's a center for ibogaine, which is the active substance in an African root called iboga, which has been used for opiate addictions. So specifically heroin addictions. And so there's a center in Toronto that's working therapeutically with that substance. And then you mentioned these other ones, Remedy and Field Trip. And then it's interesting, with MDMA, so this is like a classic party drug that people were using just at like raves, which under the right setting and therapeutic guidance can be used to work with PTSD in couples therapy, to reconnect to your partner, like in all these really powerful ways. And it's essentially using the same substance, but just directing the effects of it to this more therapeutic means that can be super powerful. Cutting off a bit, but I wanted to just say, so Fadiman actually, because there've been a little bit of anecdotal studies, and I think it was a couple years ago, Thomas Anderson at the University of Toronto, he just polled people on Reddit and just asked them sort of, okay, how do you use, how do you microdose? What dose do you take? What do you notice? And so people were sort of just volunteering information. And so obviously that's not scientific. It's not controlled. We don't have a control group, and we're not randomizing anyone. People are just volunteering themselves and their information. But it was the sort of preliminary data that you need to collect before you get approval to do a big trial. And then I think James Fadiman, the author of the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, just recently presented at a conference an open label trial, which means he didn't have a control group and there was no placebo. He did an open label trial on microdosing. And he found that so people were reporting like decreased depression, decreased anxiety, more creativity, more focus. Let me pull up some more things that he talked about. And it was a large trial. It was about 400 people. He found that they were more determined, more energy, more alertness, more pride, interestingly enough, like a sense of achievement, and feeling more strong, able to cope with difficulties, and enthusiastic. And they did actually report feeling a little bit jittery and agitated. And then they noticed a very significant drop in their feelings of depression, or feeling upset, guilty, and afraid. And most of the participants were dealing with depression. It wasn't necessarily a diagnosis, but they self-reported depression. That was one of their main goals for microdosing, was to decrease their depressive states. And so it's like this accumulation of research is happening, moving towards more randomized control trials, which is very exciting and interesting.
Yeah, exactly. There's just more people who are realizing how powerful and beneficial these substances can be. And like we both said a few times, it's this third wave. And so what do we mean by that? So the first wave was really, when these substances were created, when Albert Hofmann first discovered LSD, went on his bicycle ride was the first time it was ingested intentionally, and noticed the power of these substances. And there was a ton of clinical research being done in the States, in Canada, in Saskatchewan, actually in Europe, of how LSD and also MDMA can help with mental health and so many other things. And then we sort of had the second wave was that summer of love and all of the hippie kind of culture, counterculture during the Vietnam War and President Nixon. And we have this outspoken character, Timothy Leary, who sort of tainted the perception of psychedelics and caused them to be scheduled and create the legal situation that they were that they are currently in most places. So the counterculture being the second wave, and then us being in this third wave now, where people have been fighting really hard along the way since all their research has been shut down, to bring them back because they saw the powerful effect that these substances can have and how beneficial they are. And so this third wave is really, within the confines of what our governments will, of course, as that's happening, you have people being interested and experimenting on their own. And, that's bringing more people be like, okay, wow, I had this profound life-changing experience. How can I make this more accessible for other people? And MAPS actually put out a book called The Acid Test, which goes through a whole history of LSD and MDMA from that first wave, and tells a few different stories, including Rick Doblin, who's the founder of MAPS. A really good read if you are interested in sort of like the history of it and what brings us today and the state of it all right now.
Mm-hmm. It's called Acid Trips, you said?
The Acid Test.
The Acid Test. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it gives us sort of the overview. And I also really love the thirdwave.co is a really great resource too. It's Paul Austin's work. He's a great website, a lot of free information in a microdosing course. And that's awesome. Yeah. It's sort of speaking to, it's like this third wave is this push for more research, more legitimization, because so many people, you can't ignore, 400 people. I think there was a few thousand that reached out to Fadiman to be part of the study. So it's like thousands of people becoming more mainstream. And you can't deny that people are reporting positive effects, whether it's, at this point, it's just anecdotal, but when you have a vast number of people reporting similar things, it's not something you can ignore, especially when we're dealing with so many issues of substance addiction and mental health issues that people are struggling with. And if this is a potential for healing that or helping with that, then that's something that I think we need to look into.
Yeah.
You froze.
Yeah, it's to access, but when you see some of the clinical trials that are occurring, which are more through those macro doses or breakthrough doses than microdosing, but when you see the efficacy in those trials as well as the safety, it's hard to ignore. Like people using psilocybin for alcohol addiction, I forget the exact numbers, but I think it has something like a 72% success rate up to 2 years post ingestion of the medicine versus, AA has a 28% success rate. So such a profound difference in success and helping people from the tools that are most commonly used right now as well.
I think the founder of AA originally, when he developed the program, incorporated psychedelics into the healing protocol, and then that got dropped. But
exactly. So an acid trip was sort of the beginning of the AA healing process.
And then all of a sudden now it's kind of dropped out. Now we're returning to it to find that it's maybe even more successful. And I wonder if those two combined, as it was originally intended, would be even greater success.
Exactly.
Because you were mentioning before we started recording about this idea of integration, that maybe you could talk about in when it comes to integrating experiences that people have.
Yeah. And I mean, that definitely applies to much more than psychedelics. I think often there's so many opportunities for profound experience in our life. And it's bringing those moments of awareness and that connection that we feel to ourselves or others or nature and the environment when we have these profound moments. Is how do we bring that back into our day-to-day life? Even, going on an amazing 2-month backpacking trip, and you're interacting with all these different cultures and environments, and you feel a profound shift. And how do you bring that back and integrate that to how you see your everyday life and what you want moving forward, and your vision for yourself in this human experience? And applying that to psychedelic experiences is the way that they were traditionally used as well. There was always support when using plant medicines and ritual and ceremony. Integration was always a piece of it, and there was, that community aspect to it. And it's such an important piece of using them as medicine as well. A lot of these clinical trials, there's tested, then you have your trip using whatever substance, and then there's a certain number of appointments afterwards where you're being completely supported and allowing yourself to integrate that experience in a safe space and process it, because some of these experiences can be really profound and change the way you see everything. So having that as a one-off moment does not have the same value as learning how to take that knowledge and education and bring it into how you then experience your life moving forward. And that lack of integration is sort of where a lot of issues, that kind of agitation and anxiety we were speaking of earlier when microdosing, is a lot of people obviously are just experimenting on their own. So there's not that support when something comes up and, maybe this unconscious memory or of repressed trauma or a wound, or you're seeing something in a different way and you don't have someone to support you. Like, what do you do with it? And that kind of is where that exacerbation of the anxiety can occur as well. So integration is a really important piece of the puzzle of using psychedelic medicines moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially when sometimes experiences can be so profound and so earth-shattering that we don't often see the bridge towards, maybe it shows us something that we want or something that's not working in our lives, but there's no pathway to access what we ultimately know we want. And so that could be overwhelming in a sense. Like if you're like, oh, I hate my job or my relationship is terrible. It can be, where do I start with changing these things? And sometimes even just the slower process of microdosing maybe can lead someone in that direction, or the integration process where then you can work with somebody one-on-one or even in a group setting to figure out, okay, exactly I've learned all of these really important things, seen all of these things. How do I now bring that into my daily life, as you said? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. And do you have any stories what are, we were both talking before we started recording that, obviously, so we can't recommend these things to patients. So patients are sort of coming in asking about these things, or maybe already trying them on their own. And I'm wondering what you see in practice, or what you have access to. I mean, we have access to people who are doing various things to support their health or trying different things as a way to gain healing. And so microdosing is one of those things as it enters mainstream that more people are talking about. Yeah.
I've definitely had some people reach out, patients and non-patients, ask me about microdosing, especially during this pandemic, when you sort of have the safe space to experiment with your consciousness in a different way, because you don't really have to leave your house. So that fear of being, tripping in society and being around people or being able to effectively do your job, there's a little bit of that removed as well. And we're going through a collective trauma at the moment. So it's kind of a optimal time for people who are interested in that, if to be able to provide them with education for something that someone's still going to experiment with, no matter what anyone else says or does. So yeah, I found, especially in this moment though, there's a lot of increased anxiety and stress overall for many people. And found that with the patients that have been asking me about microdosing or potentially experimenting themselves, that they've been noticing that as well. And I think a piece of that is the lack of kind of community and connection that we're experiencing overall. And then I've also had people find it really beneficial to have that moment of like grounding and connection to themselves and to see things from a different perspective when like the world around them is changing as we know it anyway. So how do we kind of reconnect to ourselves and bring that foundation to the uncertainty around us?
Mm-hmm. It's a good point, right? It's like now that we're not able necessarily to explore the external world, it's all about this internal exploration. Now we're an opportunity for that. But then at the same time, and I've heard this as well, that it can just introduce us to the profound loneliness or agitation or anxiety that we're feeling. And maybe in a way, by exposing us or really highlighting that, allowing us to heal from it or acknowledge it or sit with it. But it can be very powerful and sometimes unexpected if that's not what we're going for. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And here's where the integration comes in, hopefully, if it's accessible to people. And I think, it's one of those things where when somebody's looking to, like you mentioned neuroplasticity, and we sort of grazed over it, and this idea of changing negative mood states or actually even mental health diagnoses. There's this growth factor called BDNF, brain derived neurotrophic factor, that seems to be at the helm of a lot of depression and anxiety, and it's all about accessing that can help shift mood, whether that be through exercise or sleep or cold therapy or whatever people are doing to help their health, all of these different techniques that we're uncovering. And then psychedelics being potentially another way to create this neuroplasticity and neurogenesis to shift things. And then you mentioned and then we talked as well about the default mode network and how the neuroplasticities are way out of that default mode network. And it's not necessarily the default mode network is bad. It's like whenever you're sitting on a park bench and sort of just daydreaming, the default mode network is active. But I think what happens in depression or anxiety is it becomes negative rumination, and it tends down those tracks that you mentioned, those paths. And that through psychedelic therapy, it can shift to something different. There was another story I just wanted to mention that I uncovered. It was interesting. It was about how microdosing increased both divergent and convergent creativity. And divergent being so it was so convergent thinking is about sort of like finding one concept that can be combined with other concepts. It's like kind of, everything goes to one answer. So, what's common amongst the words man, market, and bowl would be super, like Superman, supermarket, Super Bowl. So like, I think it's called the creative associations task, whereas divergent thinking is more coming up with various possibilities and solutions, like what are all the ways you could use a brick for? And psychedelics both increase both of those things, which is what people in Silicon Valley are finding when they're microdosing or experimenting with it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any stories you have or that you've heard or things like that?
I mean, the stories I've heard, nothing so specific overall, but just how, the people that have shared with me stories of their experimentation with these substances, how just a seemingly small perspective shift or realization while they're experiencing the effects of the substance can be so long lasting, even if it's just a simple way of like, oh, I didn't see this in this way before. So that's a little bit vague, but just to say that the openness of the neural connections that has been documented and experienced while on these or using these substances can have even just subtle effects that are so long lasting. And in a lot of the research, there's something used called the mystical experience. The people that score highest on this questionnaire of having a profound mystical experience see the most long-lasting positive benefit and effect from that experience as well. So when you connect to something greater than self and greater than this moment, and that mystical experience is sort of that connection to divine or God or universe or whatever word that you feel comfortable using to is a piece of what makes it so profound and long-lasting as well.
Mm-hmm. You said there was a mystical experience questionnaire or scale?
Yeah, so that's sort of what's been used in some of the research to see, okay, well, what kind of experience did this person have and how profound was it in this moment and how profound is it 3, 6, 9, and 12 months after the trial as well.
That's beautiful. I think they did that as well with people who were in palliative care or who had end-stage cancer too. Is that what you're? Yeah. And it changed their relationship with death and their feelings of happiness, well-being. And so this could be done with people who are just trying to process a end-of-life experience almost.
Yeah, exactly. So some of the two main areas of research coming up in using these substances is the MDMA for PTSD, as we mentioned earlier, and then as well psilocybin for end-of-life anxiety, most specifically with cancer patients, as you were saying.
It's so powerful, right? And I think I never saw it this way before. It's such a great quote. It's this idea of this wonder of life, and when we're in those sort of states of awe and curiosity and in wonder, it doesn't leave much room, or at the same time it can't necessarily coexist with anxiety or rumination or self-criticism. Like those two states are quite independent of each other. And so accessing those sort of wow experiences can have a profound effect on someone's outlook. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
This is awesome, Amanda. Do you have anything else you want to share or anything you want to leave off with?
I think what I'd sort of like to leave off with is, if you're experimenting with these substances or not, but just the idea that you have the capacity to access altered states of consciousness through so many different things, like you're saying, cold therapy, breath work, cannabis, strawberries, like anything that really feels mood altering to you. And so how can we bring that idea of intention and consciousness to our day-to-day and potentially have that awareness? You feel we're getting caught in that default mode network, and just cultivate that compassionate curiosity towards ourselves. And we have access to these mystical experiences in every moment, and you don't need psychedelics to do that. It's kind of like a jet plane to get there, and it fast tracks it, or maybe opens the door for someone who isn't really familiar with how that might feel. But that's one of the things that people have told, a lot of the research and people who have shared their experiences with me is like, having that experience once opens that door, and you're able to know that things can be seen in a different way, and there's different perspectives available to us. And just moving forward, these substances have shown so much benefit to the people that have been using them in these clinical trials. And they're so safe compared to a lot of the measures that we use, especially for mental health. And this is sort of the pandemic that, as you said, we've been experiencing quietly and not so quietly for a long time. There's people struggling with mental health, and we're just at the tip of learning how to unravel that and support people through these moments and shifts in their life. And if these tools can help people, like, let's see where the research takes us. Yeah, I guess that.
I love that. That's beautiful. And I love the idea of, I mean, so in one of my episodes with Victor, my herbalist friend, we were talking about this idea of artistic sublimation that Hegel talks about. And this is this idea of being with something where you are breathing it in, essentially. So when you're talking about the strawberry, it's like you can eat a strawberry and you can have an altered state of consciousness. It's all about the intention and the attention. But with something like psilocybin, it's a little bit easier to get there. Where it establishes that baseline. And then through, establishing those baselines of those kind of almost religious experiences, right? Where we are one with nature, we're connected to nature, there's no self-consciousness. It can have a profound effect on our mood and healing, and possibly be a way out of the meaning crisis that we're in, the mental health crisis.
Yeah. So where can this take us in the future? And that's what I'm really excited about.
This is awesome. Amanda, where can people find you? Or is there anything that you're offering, or anything you want to offer people?
So you can find me at amandasatov.com. It's my website. On Instagram, I'm amandasatov.nd. So you can find me there. And happy to support people through this experience that we're all in right now. And, any sort of major, I find that I really am passionate about kind of supporting people through transitions in their life, whether that be, job changes, transition into motherhood. We have these opportunities again for, profound insight as we shift our whole reality. And if anyone is going through any of that now or at any point, I'm happy to be here as a support for that.
Beautiful. Thank you. That's awesome. Yeah. These life transitions, whatever they may be, wherever these pivotal points might be. Thank you so much, Amanda. And I hope we get to talk soon.